It's a time for boldness, the words of the 46th President of the United States in his inaugural address. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to Washington, D.C. for a special edition of the France 24 debate. Joe Biden sworn in on Wednesday. Now his first full working day, and he's got to hit the ground running on everything from COVID, the climate change, and of course, how to heal a fractured nation after a caustic and vitriolic campaign that saw his predecessor depart before the inauguration. We're going to be touching on all of those issues over the next hour with our guest, Joe Biden, who in that inaugural address recognized that the challenge before him is of historic proportions.
I promise you, we will be judged, you and I, by how we resolve these cascading crises of our era. We will rise to the occasion is the question. Will we master this rare and difficult hour? Will we meet our obligations and pass along a new and better world to our children? I believe we must. I'm sure you do as well. I believe we will. And when we do, we'll write the next great chapter in the history of the United States of America, the American story.
Well, joining us to talk about it, he is the former Vice President of the European Parliament, former Greek Foreign Minister. Stavros Lambrinidis is the European Union's ambassador to the United States. Thanks so much for speaking with us here.
Thank you for having
on
me.
France 24. Got to say, I'm a little bit jealous because you got a closer look in than I did for the inauguration. Yes. What did it feel like during that speech?
Look, it's a remarkable historical moment. But of course, there were not that many people there. So part of the electricity, part of the grandeur of that ceremony with hundreds of thousands of people, you didn't have that. But what you did have is an extremely touching speech by the president, an inspiring one, calling for unity in the country. You had the first inauguration of a woman vice president in the United States, which was historic, and for us Europeans, you can imagine a point of great enthusiasm. You had the youngest poet laureate ever read a poem that I think most people who listened to it went, wow. There's hope if you can see the light, there's hope if you can be the light. So it was a moment, I think, that signaled more than anything else what Biden wanted to signal, which is that this is a very divided country, as you said, but it cannot continue to be so. There are too many challenges that America faces internally and in the world, and it cannot afford anymore to be retracting from the world and to be retracting for its own values and from its own power.
And as a Greek, you know a thing or two about democracy and how fragile it can be also sometimes.
Yes.
And do you get the sense that this American exceptionalism, the idea that this ceremony, this ritual that you just described for us that takes place every 4 years will happen forever, that now something has changed, that it's no longer seen as a given?
Well, yes, it's clear that this country had a heart attack. It didn't die, but it had a heart attack. And that attack on the Capitol on the 6th of January, it was unprecedented, and everyone is trying to figure out why it happened. There is even an impeachment going on now for the president who has left because of the words that he used and the incitement to violence that the House found that they constituted. So there's no question that there's a lot of discussion about this, but as Ursula von der Leyen said also yesterday at the European Parliament, this is something that we in Europe also face. We have people who are very angry. We have people who feel in Europe as well that governments are not taking care of them. Whether it is their economic needs in the time of COVID crisis, or whether it is their feelings of cultural belongingness. So no one is immune from this, which is why you also saw European leaders jump in immediately after what happened in the Capitol, coming out and saying, this is not okay. We're going to stand by America. This is not the America we know. We're the two biggest allies in the world. We believe in the same values, and we're going to make sure that America knows that a freely elected president has to be approved, and that no mob can stop that or should stop that.
All right, his predecessor spoke about America first. Joe Biden, who is going to change tack and already has done so when it comes to the United States' place on the world stage. It's a report by Sanam Chantier.
Joe Biden is taking the helm of a nation wrestling with political fissures. On top of that, his predecessor's handling of foreign policy has had a major impact on how the world sees the US. Relations between Washington and Beijing have reached a historic low. The Asian country on Wednesday dismissed allegations that it was committing genocide against Uyghurs. These claims are also shared by the incoming Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. China, however, hopes these tensions are temporary.
I hope China and the United States will be able to meet each other halfway in the spirits of mutual respect, equality and benefit to get our relationship back on a healthy track as soon as possible.
Biden is also against the clock to avert a new arms race. Russia, for its part, has been sending positive signals. The Kremlin on Wednesday announced that it remains committed to salvaging a landmark nuclear arms accord known as New START. That's due to expire in days. But there'll also be key challenges. Biden will be taking a tough line on Moscow on a host of issues, including human rights. Now back to the subject of disarmament. Iran has also called on the US to return to the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, and lift sanctions imposed on Tehran by the Donald Trump administration. But time is running out. Tehran is facing its own elections in June, and that comes with a set of demands.
The ball is in America's court. If they return to their commitments, we will do the same. The Trump era is over. His political career has ended. But the JCPOA continues to live.
As for the European Union, the bloc's top diplomats saluted a new dawn, calling for a revival of the tattered transatlantic partnership. However, this will not be an easy feat. A long list of issues is waiting Biden's attention.
We should work on 5 priorities. First, boosting multilateral cooperation. Second, combating COVID-19. Third, tackling climate change. Fourth, rebuilding our economies. And fifth, joining forces on security and peace.
And so over the coming months, all eyes will be on the US administration, one that has pledged to usher in a palpable shift in the country's approach to world affairs. But according to some observers, there are also concerns that Joe Biden could fall into stale patterns with global leaders such as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, and we're in the company of EU Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis. Before I ask about the relationship between the EU and the United States, there's perhaps an anecdote on Wednesday that's been a little bit overlooked because there's been so much news, and that is the top scientist in charge of handling the COVID pandemic here in the U.S., Anthony Fauci, picking up the phone and speaking with the World Health Organization, which Donald Trump left. And the question of, for 4 years, we've had this argument over whether or not multilateralism works in these times, these uncertain times. Your thoughts on that?
Well, COVID is a classic example of why multilateralism works, and if it doesn't, it has to, because it's a global crisis, and unless we resolve it everywhere, we will always be in danger in our societies. And this is why the European Union, from the moment this crisis hit, first became much more coordinated internally, as you know, our member states, although health is not a competence of the Union per se. Then we moved on to coordinate with others to ensure that vaccines, therapeutics, could get to every corner of the world, could be funded, and then reach people that are not as rich as we are. And we thought that this was both our, if you like, moral imperative, but also our geostrategic interest. Because there are countries out there that try to use the COVID crisis to act like Mother Teresa's of the world, when in fact it is Europe, the United States, others who are by far the biggest development aid donors around the world, and by far those who can and have supported traditionally.
But we're witnessing on both sides of the Atlantic the same tensions over who gets access to the vaccine first.
We are, but I think now with the Biden administration, we will both agree, and what you mentioned about Fauci talking to the WHO is important, that we also have a responsibility to ensure that this vaccine goes to others, perhaps not immediately, but goes to others. Because there are many people out there that the WHO has been at the front lines every day since COVID broke out, helping to save lives and save livelihoods. The funding from the EU has supported the WHO to do that, but those people would have died without that support. And had they died, Had the message been that we in the West ignored them, that would have been a disaster. So I'm proud of what the EU achieved, but I'm looking very much forward to EU leadership as well. If we join hand, US leadership, if we join hand with the Biden administration on this, I think this virus will be killed much faster.
Now, back in December, before Germany handed over the rotating presidency of the EU, we saw Angela Merkel sort of reach over the outgoing president and issue, I don't know, you could call it a call, a plea, or in any case, reaching out to Joe Biden and saying, look, together, we're going to have to work, repair our relationship with, in one nation in particular in mind, China.
Yes.
How does it work on that score?
Well, we've already looking forward to having a first EU-US dialogue on China. We are suggesting already in our own joint communication, our own proposal to the U.S. new administration.
Have you heard from the incoming Biden administration? Have they spoken to you?
Not. I mean, we've spoken in many ways that are not direct, because they cannot do that. But there's a great interest in engaging on China, because indeed we both understand that this is a real challenge when it comes to unfair competition. I mean, we're coming out of COVID. Our economies have collapsed. We cannot be growing out of this with a China that is undermining, through unfair trade practices or major subsidies, the world trade system. We're also talking about values, though, and how important it is to ensure that in this world, where many countries are sitting on the fence, it is not the sirens of authoritarians that win the day, but it is, in fact, a rejuvenated democratic alliance, which is the values that unite the EU and the US. So. And when it comes to issues like the environment, we also understand that when China is the biggest polluter around the world today, it is not possible but to try to cooperate with China. It is a sophisticated approach. It's a more nuanced one than just saying that this person is white and this person is black. But we fully understand the dangers posed by China, and we also fully understand the importance of working with it in some key issues, again, multilaterally.
And the U.S. returning to the Paris Climate Change Accords, which I know for a lot of environmentalists is not enough. Nonetheless, does that put the pressure on the likes of China to raise their game?
Yes, I think certainly it puts the pressure on many countries, not just China, to raise their games. And there's going to be a lot of work in the U.S. as well, dealing with the environmental issues. We have already suggested to the new administration a number of initiatives we can take together. How to, for example, work on sustainable finance. You're going to need trillions of euros to invest in order to have the climate transition. It's not going to be just government money. It's got to be companies and funds and others who understand that if they invest in particular green investments, that's going to be to their benefit, economic benefit as well. But that requires rules. We are talking with the Americans about creating a climate tech alliance. Let's look at everything from better batteries to using hydrogen. To having storage capacity so that the alternative energy, the clean energy we produce, can be stored. All these things, again, a EU-US cooperation can bring them to the fore much faster than anything else. We can be the first movers in this and therefore be able to support third countries around the world, including China, if it desires that support in their own transition. So yes, climate is big, but of course the president here, we also have to deal with the Congress, because many of the things that he has to do require money. And the question is, will the Senate, as it is now, 50-50, with the Vice President breaking the vote, will it have enough votes to give the President all the investment that he requires, infrastructure investment, other investments? We are working as Europeans, not just with the federal government. The past 4 years have been rather sad when it comes to American commitment, unfortunately, to the environment. But we expanded our work with states. You know what? There's an alliance of U.S. states that comprise more than 60% of U.S. GDP, more than 60% of the U.S. population, who for the past 4 years have stuck by the Paris Agreement. And we have been working with them directly in order to be able to harness all the economic benefit that comes from this, in addition, of course, to protecting the globe, which is not a hoax. And I am very pleased that the Biden administration is coming in and telling the world, we believe it's not a hoax. We're going to stand by you, work with you, lead with you to make the change.
All right, the upbeat assessment there regarding the future from Stavros Lambrinidis. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
EU ambassador. And yeah, it's early days. Crisis can be opportunity. Say, incoming members of the administration is what Joe Biden said in his inaugural address. An inaugural address which we remember, but also the scaled-down festivities. They may have been virtual. Nonetheless, there were celebrations in the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday evening. Yeah, you see images there of Joe Biden entering the White House for the first time as president alongside his wife Jill on Wednesday. We saw those first executive orders that were signed from the Oval Office. Now the work continues, and the first full working day is a busy one. Who better to bring on than correspondent Ketevan Gorjestani? Ketevan, does it feel different in Washington right now?
It does, actually. First of all, because we're seeing slowly but surely those fences, those roadblocks, those checkpoints starting to come down. So it feels like we're finding our city, we're getting our city back. But besides that, it was a very different but a very normal inauguration in a way, which was something that we weren't sure we were going to get. But we got all the traditional elements of an inauguration.
What was your highlight?
For me, the highlight was that the part on the inaugural ceremony on the Capitol steps, because we remembered what happened 2 weeks ago, what happened on those Capitol steps. There were people where those guests were sitting. There were rioters there attacking the Capitol, and then 2 weeks later, the United States was able to stage a traditional, normal inauguration, and all went according to plan.
And we saw the first White House press briefing. Did it feel like something new, or did it feel like, you were back, it was back to the future somehow? Because this was the press briefings we were used to before 2017.
It really felt like we were back to the Obama years. First of all, because Jen Psaki, the new press secretary, announced that she was going to be holding press briefings every day, Monday to Friday. She said, I'm not a monster. I'm not going to be holding briefings during the weekend.
We'll see about that.
We'll see about that. But she also, in the words she used in her introduction, as well as in answering the questions of the journalist, it really reminded me partly of some of the things that Barack Obama said for his final address to the press before leaving office. He had talked about how there were times when he disagreed with the journalist, how they were covering his administration, that there were very strong disagreements sometimes, but that the journalists were doing their jobs and he was doing his job and his press secretary was doing its job. And so Jen Psaki said that. She said, I know that at some point we're not going to be agreeing, we're not going to be seeing the same things, but we are all in agreement that we are here to tell the truth. And that, of course, was a direct jab to what we've seen in the past 4 years, whether we had press briefings without any questions and answers, whether you had Kelly McEnany directly attacking some of the journalists by name.
Directly attacking the journalists, however, Donald Trump gave a lot of access to journalists in a way his predecessor did not. Is Biden going to be accessible?
Well, that's the real question, because if you have a very good and present press secretary, that's also a way of not yourself being into the spotlight. So that's probably what we're going to see, at least at the beginning, if it's anything like the campaign where we saw Biden's team trying to avoid those moments where he's off the cuff with the press. So it is likely that Jen Psaki is going to take that leadership role in being the one who talks to the press. But hopefully there will be times, at least, when Joe Biden is more accessible. That said, Donald Trump was accessible in a way, but he also directly attacked the press repeatedly, called it the enemy of the people, and this is something that has totally changed.
And we're going to talk more about that, about how you have a conversation in a divided nation later on in this show. One final question for you. When we see that long list of priorities, we've talked about climate change, we've talked about COVID with Ambassador Lambrinidis. Your thoughts on where Biden's priorities lie?
Well, the first priority is, of course, tackling the coronavirus pandemic, and he showed that by picking the first executive order to sign to be that mask mandate. It is pretty symbolic because that's a mask mandate for federal properties. He doesn't have the authority to institute a nationwide ban, but the fact that he did that he signed that first one was to show that he was taking this very seriously. And today we're going to see more announcements, more executive orders on how to tackle a coronavirus, because that he said it before. He said, until we tackle the coronavirus, we can't tackle the economic crisis, and we can't tackle all of the other challenges if we don't deal with this.
Of course, there is the other challenge, which is how he deals with his predecessor. First one impeached twice in U.S. history. Ketevan Gorjestani, many thanks. And we saw Donald Trump, who struck a little more of a conciliatory note, although he never named Joe Biden personally. Biden, who since said that first letter that letter that was left for him by his predecessor was courteous. Nonetheless, we heard the words of Donald Trump about whether or not he's going away. This is what he had to say on Wednesday morning at Andrews Air Force Base.
I wish the new administration great luck and great success. I think they'll have great success. They have the foundation to do something really spectacular. And again, we put it in a position like it's never been before, despite the worst plague to hit since, I guess you'd say 1917, over 100 years ago. And despite that, the things that we've done have been just incredible, and I couldn't have done it without you. So just a goodbye. We love you. We will be back in some form.
Well, here with me to talk about it is former federal prosecutor Eric Leeson. Always a pleasure, sir.
My pleasure.
So we just heard the U.S. president, the former U.S. president, boast about his achievements. Of course, he's going to stay in the news, what with that impeachment trial by the Senate that is coming up. First question, when you see the tone of the outgoing team, how does Joe Biden handle that? What does he do?
He has a very difficult path because he has to balance two competing interests. He wants to heal and unite the nation and move forward. He's got pressing urgencies like the pandemic. At the same time, there can be no unity, there can be no healing without accountability. And the task of accountability is going to be very, very difficult, and it's going to be with him throughout. I think initially he felt like he could put it behind him. He could kind of play the role of let's not dwell and dawdle too long and all that went wrong. But that's not the right approach, because what happened here is too serious. And regardless of what Biden wants, there's going to be others that are going to be pursuing the president, justifiably or no. There's going to be a pack of legal wolves, in a Shakespearean sense, crying havoc and letting loose the dogs of war, literally after Trump all the time. And part of this is going to be bound in with the national fabric of how to move forward. These things are going to have to be confronted, and Biden's going to have to be weighing the necessity of holding people accountable for conflicting criminal views sometimes while getting everybody together. It's no easy job.
And we know that convincing 17 Republican senators out of 50 to cross the aisle and vote for the impeachment article that's been handed up by the House, it looks like a tall order at this point.
It looks tall. Certainly it seemed that way and was in the last impeachment, but we have to remember things are very, very different now. Trump is no longer the president. I mean, so from one moment to the next, his political landscape has completely changed. And the people, those very same senators, for the most part, that were sitting in judgment of him before, they were afraid of him because he was the president, because they knew he was not unwilling to exact any kind of retribution that he could. And he occupied the most powerful office in the land. Now we see already Mitch McConnell saying, look, I'm not going to whip the votes. I'm not going to hold you to it. What he did was wrong. What he did was very serious.
Not whip the votes, but we do see a lot of lawmakers saying, Republican lawmakers saying what he did was serious, what he did was awful. But look, you've had your second impeachment, which is unprecedented. You've made your point. We have to move on.
Yes, there are people that are saying that now. That is absolutely true. Whether it will be enough to counterbalance some of the obvious defections that people will calculate they need to engage in on the Republican side, some of the so-called, moderate Republicans, some who are genuinely appalled and feel like the president has to be accountable. We'll have to see how that balances out. But there's going to be a lot of Republicans who are now worried in the Senate about how they're going to look to the judgment of history for themselves. They were able to dodge that before. Now they can't do it. And this is very much more an even negotiation.
An even negotiation. We're seeing in as well another aspect of this. We heard Joe Biden say the words white supremacist, that we have to tackle that in his inauguration speech. And he talked about radicalization. The civil service, the high civil service in the U.S., is always a little bit politicized, but now it's off the scales, right? And as a result, you can't just in one day bring in a new team at every important post. Is the U.S. right now a soft target for terror attacks from white supremacists?
Well, it obviously it has been. I mean, whether soft or hard, we saw at the Capitol, the U.S. is extremely vulnerable. And this has now been recognized, and it has to be brought forward so that everybody can confront it. Trump was deliberately, just like the Russian threat, he was deliberately calling all of these things a hoax. He wouldn't address it because it affected him negatively in his ability to retain power. What Biden is saying is, look, we can't pity-pat around with this anymore. We're going to have to deal with it. My national security team, my intelligence people have a consensus that this is a threat that we all need to address and confront. So it's out there and there's no getting around it. It's going to be necessary to going forward. You cannot have a unified, healed nation if a significant part of that nation is buying into an ideology and buying into supposed factual predicate that lays the seeds for the destruction of what makes that nation what it is.
All right. And again, you still have 70% of those who voted for Donald Trump, according to surveys, who think he's right, that the vote was somehow stolen. I don't want to go back over that argument because but I just wanted to say, going forward, how does Biden convince enough of them that he is their president?
It's pure hard work. There's no other way to do it than to have the real dialogue, confront these people head on. Some of them will never be changed. But the way that these people have been radicalized must be addressed. There's black holes in the gaps in enforcement and then legal accountability for it. People have been afraid to confront it. It's been swept under the rug. People have been thinking it's so crazy it's going to go away. It's been fueled by the fact that Trump is in the White House. All of this is true to a certain extent, but it's not going to go away by itself. And this is what I think Biden has come to realize. And he's not afraid to take it on. It's going to be an existential issue for him.
Former federal prosecutor Eric Glisson, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for stopping in.
Thank you.
And you heard Eric mentioning there how for Biden going forward, it's going to have to be a dual track, dealing with his predecessor and dealing with the long list of things that need fixing in the United States. Wasim Cornet has more.
Just hours into the presidency and already at work, Joe Biden spent part of Wednesday afternoon at the White House signing a series of executive orders aimed at undoing part of Donald Trump's legacy. The first order of business was to make mask wearing mandatory in federal buildings and on federal land in an attempt to slow the spread of coronavirus.
And the first order I'm going to be signing here relates to COVID, and it's requiring, as I said all along, where I have authority, mandating masks be worn, social distancing be kept on federal property.
Another order Biden signed, the return of the United States in the Paris Climate Agreement, an accord Trump had decided to leave last year.
Just like we need to be a unified nation in response to COVID-19, we need a unified national response to climate change. We need to meet the moment with the urgency it demands.
Biden has promised to put the country on a track to net zero emissions by 2050, in line with most developed nations. Immigration will also be at the center of the new president's policy shift. Biden signed an executive order to halt the construction of the U.S.-Mexico border wall and a memo directing the Department of Homeland Security to preserve the DACA program, which protects migrants who came to the country as children.
And our community is here with the hope to see change and to share that hope and feel that change finally is going to come. And hope is what we all have at this point after 4 painful years we have gone through.
Other orders were also signed: the end of a travel ban from 13 Muslim-majority countries, the revocation of a permit for a controversial transcontinental pipeline project, and the extension of a federal freeze on evictions. More major decisions are expected in the coming days.
And with us to talk about it is the Reverend Amy Butler, who is pastor of the National City Christ Church, part of the Disciples of Christ. You're also on the Faith Advisory Committee for the Biden campaign, right? Or for the incoming administration? Yes. Which one was it?
Yes, for the campaign.
For the campaign. Thank you so much for being with us here
of
on France 24. Before I ask you a bit to reflect on what we saw in that ceremony on Wednesday, you just saw in that report all the different executive orders that were signed. What would be, I guess, top of your bucket list among the priorities of your congregation when you look at that list of things that were signed?
That's a very hard question to answer, but there are many issues that communities of faith have been speaking out on very loudly for the past 4 years. I would say issues around immigration in particular and the travel ban speak to some of the core values that we've been preaching and speaking about.
Particularly here in Washington, D.C., which is, you see all the federal buildings around us here, but it's a city that's, 60-70% black. A lot of neighborhoods are very poor, and it's in such a contrast. You arrived here in the Capitol just as the Black Lives Matter protests were starting up.
Yes, and I think, that's sort of fundamental to the fear that we've been living with over the last 4+ years. Things that have always been part of American society but have now come to the surface and forced us to really grapple with them in conjunction with the values we hold.
Explain for our world viewers here how much faith and churches matter in these struggles, because people watching from abroad who don't follow U.S. news very closely, they see headlines that only involve right-wing fundamental Christians. But it's not that simple in the United States, is it?
No, it isn't. And I understand that religion being part of the political discourse is kind of strange for folks from other places, but it's been part of American tradition. And we hold very dear the separation of church and state. That is, anyone from any religious perspective can come and practice freely in America. In the last 4 years, that has been hijacked by the far-right evangelicals. And I think part of the religion you saw yesterday was an effort to really take back that mantle a bit.
Yeah, because there's faith at every U.S. inauguration. There's always an invocation. There's always a prayer. We heard the U.S. president also issue his own prayer. Of course, I forgot, the Catholic Mass at the beginning of the day. These are the normal trimmings of any U.S. inauguration, or was this one slightly different?
I saw more religious elements to this inauguration, and I mentioned actually the other night at the memorial service that Biden held that, our political leaders are doing the work of the clergy in this moment because our country has not grieved the great loss and trauma that we've been through.
Yeah, you're having to hold a lot of your services online.
Yes, in fact, it's a new congregation for me, many of whom I've never met in person.
Never met in person. What's it like? Tell us.
It's hard, and particularly in this moment when we're living with so much fear and people are longing for community, and we are having to reinvent ways to find it.
All right, community, and we heard Joe Biden say it in his speech that he wants to be the president of, and to defend those who didn't vote for him as well. So As a person of faith, Reverend Butler, how do you reach out to those who don't even think you won the election?
Right. We have a great job ahead of us. I think the best way that we're going to bridge this divide is by talking about our shared values. You know, the president mentioned that yesterday, but issues of caring for our neighbor, of building a community where everyone can thrive, we have to communicate those in such a way that people across the aisle can embrace them.
And all right, but then if you're some of those Trump supporters who feel disenfranchised, who are struggling, in some cases perhaps feel desperate, and they're saying, hey, all the attention is on immigrants and on blacks. What about me?
It's not a bad thing to say. It is not our values to exclude our neighbor. It is not our values to live selfishly. You know, as Americans, we have to uphold those values, and as people of faith, we would say that's even more important.
On the immigration question specifically, I know it's something you've worked on
Yes.
In the past. It seems like it's binary, right? You either agree or you don't. So what do you do?
Well, from a faith perspective, you know, our holy text talks about welcoming the stranger again and again and again. There is no gray area for us. And this country and its history has been a place where strangers are welcomed, and that needs to be the case again.
Even though this is a world where people are scared about outsourcing, scared about the fact that they're losing their jobs.
You know, we're living among people who are scared to open the front door because they don't know if they're going to be separated from their families and return to countries they've never lived in their memory. So, you know, that needs to stop, and we need to come up with some policy that is fair, humane, and cares for our neighbors.
Joe Biden, what do you make of the fact that he puts the accent on his Catholic faith?
I think that's great for Americans to understand that, you know, Christianity in America is not one stripe. There are so many of us, and that more progressive, traditional perspective is a welcome voice after 4 years of extremism.
All right, I want to thank you so much, Reverend Amy Butler, for being with us. Good luck. There's a lot of work ahead for you.
Thank you.
All right, and as you see, that's one perspective on what happens going forth. Our team went to Virginia and spoke with people who were supporting the Trump side a few days back. Particularly what we're seeing is that the conversation is very different according to what media you watch or listen to. They spoke to one conservative radio talk show host who's just been kicked off YouTube and who had this to say.
We have been deplatformed and banned from YouTube for life. So 10 years of my work down the drain. Thank you, YouTube, for disenfranchising my 50,000 followers. The further this goes, the bigger the backlash is going to be. We're going to find our own platforms. We're going to develop those. And basically, the first thing we're going to do is take over the Republican Party in its entirety by nominating pro-Trump, pro-America First conservatives, because we control the votes. We have the people. We have people in numbers. They have power and they have money. The Republican Party right now, without Trump voters, consists of Mitch McConnell and a spreadsheet with money people on it. Their party is a donor list and a phone. That's it. Our party is 70 million people. We have the numbers. We have the speed. They have the power and the money. I like our odds.
Well, to react to that, journalist and author Tom Ferrero has been covering Washington since 1980. Thank you for joining us here on France 24.
Good to be here.
Yeah, you just heard there that conservative radio talk show host saying, all right, I've been kicked off YouTube, but I'm going to come back in a different form, and I fancy my odds, as opposed to the leadership of the Republican Party that's choosing to ignore us. So how's the media landscape evolving right now, in the days to come, what with these social media bans and these closing down of accounts?
Well, the social media, it'll be back. I don't think it's gone. Trump proved the 2016 election was the Twitter election, and that's how Trump made his mark. I can't imagine we're going to go back to just reading newspapers on hard paper. I think social media is here to stay. And
is there going to be a digital reckoning now where, there's been this talk about the rules under which free speech is regulated or not, depending on how you look at it, date back to 1996, which in internet years is the Stone Age.
Right.
So there's been promises that there's going to be a new push for regulation. I know we've been talking about it in Europe. Is it really going to happen, though?
I don't think you could predict. I think there'll be a push for it, absolutely. There'll be big money for it. It'll be waged with money and influence. It depends on how it's going to work out. I just don't think it's safe to make a nailed down a prediction of how it's going to shake out. But I'd be very surprised if social media doesn't remain a force.
So you said 2016 was the Twitter election. What do you say 2020 was?
Well, it was an extension of the Twitter election. Twitter, I think, dates back only to 2006. But Trump quickly mastered it in short sound bursts and in short messages, and was able to make his message be heard, be read, and be a force.
So when you started covering Washington, there was the nightly mass, as we call it in France, which is the evening news. Now everybody can listen to their own stations. Are you sensing that now that Trump is gone, there's a change in tack on the part of the media that's more on his side?
More on Trump's side? I think the media. The media was basically, well, you got lots of media. You got right wing media, you got left wing media, you got left liberal media, mainstream media. If you turn on the evening news nowadays and flip the dial, you'll see a range of politics.
And that's not going to change, is what you're saying.
I don't think so.
All right, and so Joe Biden's going to be confronted with that. Now you've covered Capitol Hill over the years, and you've also covered his campaign when he was running for vice president in 2008. How does he handle what he termed in that speech this uncivil war that's unfolding?
Well, I covered Biden mainly on the Hill, and what Biden did, Biden enjoyed bringing people together. He brought people together to find common ground.
Which works in a back room, but it doesn't work so well when you're in that building, does it?
We're going to find out. Biden, when he was on the Hill, he had friends on the other side of the aisle. Mitch McConnell, Republican leader in the Senate, was a friend of Joe Biden. Mitch McConnell went to Biden's son's funeral. John McCain, one of the most powerful Republicans on Capitol Hill during Biden's time, was also a friend of.
But that was then, this is now, and it's gotten so much more caustic and vitriolic.
Well, that's going to be the test for Joe Biden. Joe Biden got elected by large part because he gets along with people, and that's going to be the test for Joe Biden in his inaugural address.
Is he up to it?
From what I saw on the Hill, I feel uncomfortable. I wouldn't bet against Joe Biden getting along with people. You had Lindsey Graham, who was one of Trump's biggest supporters. In 2015, Lindsey Graham, Republican, said, God didn't make a better man than Joe Biden. Lindsey Graham also said, Biden has the experience and the empathy to work across the aisle. So Biden has done this in the past, and I think Biden is coming to the White House, got elected to the White House to be able to talk to people and get things done. We're gonna find out pretty quickly if it's going to work.
All right, you're hearing it there. A pinch of caution, but nonetheless, perhaps reasons to be optimistic. Tom Ferrero, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Good being here.
And we want to thank you for joining us here for this special edition of the France 24 debate from Washington, D.C. There's much more that'll on the events that are unfolding in that building over there. That's on France 24 and France24.com.